Need to check the names list carefully before writing. Names to avoid: Mara, Derek, Thomas, Claudia, Nadia, Joelle, Paul, Sandra, Vivian, Renee, Owen, Helen, Lee, Garrett, Priya, Kim, Callum, Donovan, Iris, Lily, Seth, Ben, Petra, Wesley, Connie, Francesca, Curtis, Tamsin, Edmund, Audrey, Renata, Hargrove, Elise, Gerald, Marcus, Noel, Tessa, Noah, Brandon, Amber, Claire, Jenna, Ray, Daniel, Lydia, Stephen, Kevin, Rowan, Celeste, Victor, Hadley Vance, Reeve, Breyer, Calla Whitford, Elliot, Daphne, Simone, Lena, Grant, Patricia, Rachel. New names I'll use: Sloan, narrator, 29. Weston, brother. Miriam, mother. Frank, father. Theo, younger brother. Allie. Adrian, Weston's wife. Carpenter, lawyer. I didn't cry when they read the verdict. Not one tear. I just looked at my hands, the same hands that had signed the original contracts, drawn every spec, built everything from the ground up, and I thought, okay, now I know exactly what I'm dealing with. 3 years. That was the sentence. 3 years for a building collapse I had nothing to do with. 3 years for my brother's shortcuts, my brother's greed, my brother's decision to swap load-bearing materials for cheaper ones so he could pocket the difference and call himself a businessman. My name is Sloan. I was 26 when they arrested me. I was 26 when they arrested me. I was 29 when I walked out. I want to tell you what happened in between. My father built a small electrical contracting firm when I was 8. Nothing glamorous. Residential work, the occasional commercial job. He drove a white van with a magnetic sign on the door. My mother kept the books at the kitchen table every Sunday night, receipts spread across the same surface where we'd eaten dinner 3 hours before. I grew up watching that. I watched how a business actually runs, not from textbooks, but from arguments about invoices at 10 o'clock at night and early mornings when my father left before the sun came up. I paid attention. My brother Weston didn't. Weston was 4 years older than me and had decided somewhere around age 16 that the world owed him something and he was just waiting for it to arrive. When I was 22, I graduated from Georgia Tech with a degree in civil engineering. I came home that summer with a specific idea: infrastructure consulting, starting small, targeting mid-sized commercial developers who couldn't afford the big firms but needed real expertise. I pitched it to my father over dinner. He listened. He nodded slowly the way he always did when he was genuinely interested. Weston laughed. "You're going to consult?" he said. "On what? You've never built anything." I said I was about to. My father gave me a small loan, $30,000, which he could barely spare, and I started working out of my apartment. I called the company Vance Structural. Within 18 months, I had 6 clients. Within 3 years, I had 22 and had moved into a real office with 4 employees and a proper server room. Weston had spent those same 3 years going through 2 failed businesses and asking my parents for money twice. This is when things shifted in a way I didn't fully understand until it was too late. My father sat me down one afternoon and said he wanted Weston involved in Vance Structural, not as a partner, just a role. Project coordination, client relations, something to give him structure. I said no. My father got quiet in that particular way that meant he wasn't done talking, just reloading. He said Weston was family. He said family didn't leave people behind. I said Weston wasn't qualified. My father said qualifications weren't everything. I don't know why I agreed. I think I was 25 and still believed that being good at something meant the people who loved you would eventually see it clearly. I thought if I just kept performing, kept delivering, the narrative would stay accurate. I was wrong about that. That's the thing nobody tells you about families. They don't revise the story, no matter how much evidence you provide. The story was already written before you were old enough to have a say in it. Weston joined Vance Structural in March. By September, he was asking my father why he wasn't listed as co-founder. I need to tell you about the Harmon Ridge project because that's where everything broke. Harmon Ridge was a mixed-use development in Chattanooga. Retail on the ground floor, 6 floors of residential above. Mid-size client, decent budget, exactly the kind of job we've been building toward. I put together the structural specifications myself. Every beam, every load calculation, every material grade was documented and sourced. I sent the specs to our suppliers in writing. I had my senior engineer, a woman named Dorothea who had 30 years in the field, review everything twice. What I didn't know was that Weston had been talking to the suppliers separately. I found out later, much later, that he'd been calling them directly and negotiating substitutions. Cheaper steel. Different grade concrete. He'd been pocketing the difference and routing it through a shell account his wife Adrian had set up under a different name. By the time Harmon Ridge broke ground, the materials going into that building were not the materials I had specified. I didn't know. I want to say that plainly because it matters. I did not know. In October, on a Tuesday morning, the east stairwell of Harmon Ridge collapsed during construction. 2 workers were injured, one seriously. No fatalities, but it was close. Close enough that the county inspector shut the site down within the hour and the story was on the local news by noon. I was in a client meeting when my phone started going off. I stepped out, saw 7 missed calls from Dorothea, and felt something in my chest go completely cold. By the time I got to the site, there were police cars. They weren't there for Weston. My father called me that night, not to ask if I was okay, not to ask what happened. He called to tell me that Weston had already spoken to the family's attorney, the same attorney who'd handled my father's business affairs for 20 years, and that they'd agreed the best thing was for me to cooperate fully with investigators. I said, cooperate with what? I didn't do anything. My father said the documentation showed my name on everything. I said that was because it was my company. He said Weston was under a lot of stress. I remember standing in my kitchen, still in the clothes I'd worn to that client meeting, and thinking, he actually believes this. He's actually already decided. I hadn't been arrested yet. There were no charges yet, and my father had already arranged the story to protect my brother. My mother called 10 minutes later. She said she knew this was hard. She said family had to stick together. She said, and I will never forget the exact way she phrased it, "Sloan, your brother has a family to protect." I said, so do I. It's called my company. It's called my name. She said I was being selfish. I stopped answering their calls after that. Not out of anger, or maybe some anger, but because I understood that continuing to explain myself to people who had already written the verdict was not a productive use of whatever time I had left. The indictment came 6 weeks later. Criminal negligence. 2 counts. My own attorney, not the family's attorney, a woman I found myself named Castellano who specialized in construction liability, told me the evidence chain had been deliberately constructed to point at me. Emails forwarded to my address from accounts I'd never accessed. A purchase order with my digital signature that I hadn't signed. Someone had been careful. Adrian, I found out later, had a background in finance and an understanding of digital paper trails that I had underestimated completely. I was 26 years old. I had built something real. And I stood in a courtroom and watched a jury decide I was responsible for something I hadn't done because the people who had actually done it had 3 months to construct a better story than mine. The sentence was 18 months per count, concurrent. 3 years total. I remember the judge's voice. I remember the wood of the railing under my hands. I remember turning and seeing my mother in the gallery, and she was looking at her lap. My brother wasn't there. He had sent his condolences through my father, apparently. I want to be honest about prison because I think people imagine it a certain way that doesn't match the actual experience of sitting inside it. It was not a movie. There was no dramatic moment of transformation. There was a lot of waiting. There was a lot of noise at the wrong hours. There was a particular smell that you get used to faster than you think you should. What I did, the thing I actually did during those 3 years, was work. Not physically, mentally. I had a legal pad and I had visiting privileges that I never used for my family, but used for Castellano twice a month. I had a small library and I used it. I had time, which was the one resource I'd never had before, and I used every piece of it. My brother had taken my company. My parents had signed over operational authority to him within 6 months of my conviction. They framed it as keeping the business stable. And Weston had rebranded, hired his own people, and was actively pursuing the larger contracts I'd spent years building relationships toward. I knew this because my younger brother Theo told me. Theo was 23 when I went in. He was the one person in my family who had sat in that courtroom the whole time, every day, and cried in a way he tried to hide. He visited me once a month without fail. He didn't pretend things were fine. He told me the truth about what was happening, and he did something else. He kept copies, emails, financial records, conversations he'd overheard between Weston and Adrian, bank statements he'd photographed on a phone when Adrian left it on the counter during a family dinner. He didn't fully understand what he was collecting, but he understood it mattered, and he kept everything in an encrypted folder, and he didn't tell anyone. Theo was the one who saved me. I want to be clear about that. Not a lawyer, not a system, not karma operating on its own schedule. My 23-year-old brother sitting quietly at family dinners and photographing documents he wasn't supposed to see. What I did was take what he gave me and figure out what to do with it. By the end of my second year, Castellano and I had built a full reconstruction of the material substitution fraud. We had supplier records. We had the shell account. We had 3 conversations Weston had in writing, actual texts, where he discussed the substitutions with the supplier rep in terms that were unmistakably deliberate. We had a financial forensics consultant who was prepared to testify. We filed for post-conviction relief in month 28. I didn't tell my family. I didn't tell anyone except Castellano and Theo. The morning I was released, it was early. Gray light, cold for September. The officer who processed my out-processing shook my hand, which surprised me. I walked through the door and Theo was standing by his car and he was trying not to cry again and failing again. We drove for a while without talking. Then he said, "It's already starting." I said, "Tell me." The forensic audit we'd triggered through the post-conviction filing had been referred to the county DA's office 3 weeks earlier. The DA had quietly opened an investigation into the material fraud at Harmon Ridge. Weston didn't know this yet. As far as he knew, the filing was a long shot and I was getting out on time served and going away. He had, in fact, scheduled a press event for that same week. A ribbon cutting at a new project site, the largest contract Vance Structural had ever signed, a development that traded on the reputation I had built before my conviction. He'd given an interview to a regional business publication. There were photos of him in my old office. He had framed all of it as a story of family resilience. I read the interview in Theo's car. I read it twice. I said, "Okay, let's go." I'm not going to describe the legal process in detail because it took 4 months and involved a lot of conference rooms, and I don't think that's what you actually want to hear. What I'll tell you is the shape of it. The DA's investigation found the shell account. They found 31 separate material substitution transactions over the course of 14 months. They found Adrian's financial structuring. They found the forged purchase orders, and they found the metadata, which Adrian had not thought to alter, which showed the documents had been created on a computer registered to Weston's home address 6 weeks after the Harmon Ridge collapse. Weston was arrested on a Thursday morning. I was not there. I didn't want to be. His press event never happened. The business publication pulled the interview. The development company that had signed the large contract put the project on hold pending investigation and later terminated the agreement entirely. Vance Structural, the name, the client relationships, the goodwill, was essentially worthless by the time the dust settled. Weston had expanded too fast on credit, and without the new contract, the debt structure collapsed in about 6 weeks. The company filed for dissolution in December. My conviction was formally vacated in November. Judge's order, 22 words. 3 years of my life, 22 words. I sat in the courtroom when they read it. I didn't cry. I felt something that I still don't have an accurate word for. Not happiness exactly. Not relief exactly. More like the particular sensation of a weight you've been carrying so long you forgot it was there suddenly being absent. You feel lighter. You also feel the shape of where it was. My parents called the week after the vacation. My father called first. He said he was sorry. He said he'd made mistakes. He said he hoped I could understand that he'd been in an impossible position. I listened to the whole thing. I waited until he finished. Then I said, "I understand you were in a difficult position. I want you to understand that I'm not in a position to offer you absolution for it right now. Maybe not ever. I don't know yet." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said he understood. My mother called the next day. She cried. She said she'd known something was wrong but hadn't let herself look at it directly. She said she'd been afraid of what it would mean for the family. I said, "You were afraid of what the truth would cost you. Choosing not to know is still a choice." She cried more. I didn't comfort her. That's not cruelty. Or maybe it's a small cruelty. But I'd spent 3 years in a cell comforting myself, and I didn't have any left over for the people who put me there. I didn't slam doors. I didn't make speeches. I just said what was true, and then I stopped talking. Theo came over that evening. We ordered pizza. He showed me the encrypted folder on his laptop, all of it, everything he'd collected over 3 years. 43 files. I looked at him across the table, this kid who had been 23 and scared and had shown up anyway every month without fail, and I said, "How did you know to keep all of that?" He said, "I didn't know. I just thought if I were you, I'd want someone too." People ask me what I did next, whether I rebuilt the company, whether I went after my parents, whether I sued Weston. Castellano handled the civil side. There was a settlement, not a trial, because Weston's attorney understood that a trial would be devastating and advised him accordingly. I won't say the amount. It covered my legal fees, my lost income, and something the settlement documents called additional compensatory damages. It was enough to matter. I did not rebuild Vance Structural. I thought about it for a long time. I sat with the idea of reclaiming that name, walking back into that office, hiring back the people who had left, making it mean something again. I could have. Legally and financially, I could have. But the truth is, the name felt like a scar more than a foundation. Every client relationship, every handshake, every contract I'd ever signed under that name had been contaminated by what Weston had done with it. Starting over under the same name felt like living in a house where something terrible had happened and painting over the walls and calling it new. So I didn't. I started a new firm 18 months later. Different name. Built it the same way. Slowly, carefully, on relationships and documented specifications and materials I sourced and verified myself. I have a policy now, no family, no exceptions. Not because I'm bitter. Because I understand something I didn't at 22, which is that love and business operate on different logics, and putting them in the same room doesn't improve either one. My clients don't know my history unless they ask. A few have asked. I tell them the short version, and I watch their faces to see if it changes how they see me. It doesn't usually. What it usually does is make them trust the documentation I provide, because they understand I understand what it costs when the documentation fails. I still think about the 2 workers who were injured at Herman Ridge. One of them I know had a long recovery. I thought about them in prison. I think about them now. The civil case included compensation for them, Weston's liability, not mine. Castellano made sure of that. I don't know if that's enough. I don't know what enough would look like. I don't have a clean answer for that part. Some things don't resolve. Some damage you can document and some you can't. And the ones you can't are the ones that stay with you. Weston's sentencing was in February. I didn't attend. Theo went. He texted me one word when it was over: done. I was at my desk. I had a proposal due the next morning for a commercial client in Nashville. A straightforward structural review, exactly the kind of work I was built to do. I put my phone face down and went back to it. That's the thing I want you to understand, if you take anything from this. The revenge, if that's what you want to call it, was not the point. It was a consequence. The point was the proposal on my desk. The point was the new firm. The point was the years of work I had done while no one was watching, when I had every reason to stop. That turned out to be the foundation for everything that came after. My brother thought he was taking my company. He was, technically. What he couldn't touch, what nobody in that family could touch, was the 22 pages of structural analysis I'd memorized in a prison library, the methodology. The precision, the understanding of load and stress and what holds and what doesn't that I've been building since I was 8 years old, watching my father come home with calloused hands and a magnetic sign on a white band. That's not something you can rebrand and take credit for. That's not something that goes away. I know who I am. I know what I built. I know what it cost. And I have always known, exactly what I'm dealing with. I've had a lot of time to think about cause and effect, not in the philosophical way, in a practical one. The kind of thinking you do when you have nothing but time and a legal pad and a library that closes at 8. Here's what I've come to understand. Most people who do what Weston did aren't thinking about consequences. They're thinking about the gap between what they have and what they want, and they're thinking about how fast they can close it. That's it. There's no master plan, no real strategy. Just appetite and the willingness to use whoever is standing closest. The problem with that, and it took me a while to see this clearly, is that it only works for a while. You can build something on a rotten foundation and it will stand up for a time. It will look solid from the outside. People will walk through it and not notice anything wrong. But the structural failure is already happening, slowly, invisibly, the whole time. And at some point the weight of it reaches a threshold and then it goes all at once. That's not a metaphor I use lightly. I'm a structural engineer. I watched it happen literally at Harmon Ridge. I watched it happen to my brother's life 18 months later. The physics are the same. What I want to say about Sloan, about myself, about the 3 years I spent inside, is that the only thing that kept me from losing my mind was refusing to stop thinking, refusing to become passive. There were days, plenty of them, where the easier thing would have been to accept the story other people had written about me, to internalize it, to stop fighting it in my head when there was nothing I could do externally. A lot of people do that. I understand why. It's exhausting to maintain a private truth that the entire world seems to be disagreeing with. But I didn't. I kept the record straight in my own mind. I kept building the case even when there was no one to present it to. And when Theo showed up with that folder, 43 files he'd collected over 3 years, sitting across from Weston at family dinners while I was inside, I had something to meet it with. I knew exactly what to do with the evidence because I'd already done the work. That's what I want to say about intelligence. Not the kind you're born with, the kind you practice deliberately in hard conditions, the kind that means keeping your thinking sharp when every circumstance is pushing you toward surrender. That's the thing that doesn't get taken away. That's the thing no one can rebrand and put their name on. And about my brother, I don't spend much time on anger anymore. What Weston did came from a specific kind of smallness, and that smallness was its own punishment long before the sentencing. He looked at what I'd built and couldn't tolerate it. That's not a power position, that's a prison of a different kind, and he'd been living in it for years before I ever set foot in one. I'm not glad it happened. I won't pretend those 3 years were a gift. They were real years with real costs, and some of that cost I'll be paying for the rest of my life in ways that don't show up in any settlement document. But I'm still here. I'm still building. And the foundation is solid. I checked it myself.